This question about that Badu raises around ontology and what he's, I guess, fundamentally talking about is change, that there's bodies and there's worlds and there are truths and they come through forcing. When Claire Fontaine was here last year, they spoke a little bit also is that there's this point beyond language that is about the body, and whether we're talking about contemporary social movements and others. I'm going to go and show some of the social movements in the 1930s that were essentially part of the inner city here, but at the time was essentially the central downtown core of Vancouver at the time until the downtown moved towards Robson and Georgia as the big banks moved out and the first kind of wave of disinvestment happened in what's today the downtown east side. This is a group of social activists that went with the Red Tent campaign to Ottawa on the train in commemoration of the 75th anniversary to Ottawa. This photograph's from 1935. It's the middle of the Great Depression. In December of 1934, there were relief camps that were set up around British Columbia, other parts of Canada. It was a national program put together by the federal government, and the conditions on these camps were quite terrible. People didn't have the right to vote. A big portion of the national park system in Canada was created, and this was a time, of course, where there weren't social programs in place. And in the formation of militant organizing that was happening at the time, in BC, people struck from these camps, and in December of 1934 came to Vancouver, and what ensued over the next 6 or 7 months is one of the more militant periods of organizing in Vancouver history. But this is, literally a few thousand people at what was then the Canby Street grounds, which was actually a time when we had a public square in the city. If you look beside the letter K on the photograph, that's the old Greyhound bus station that I came to when I first moved to Vancouver in 1991. Prior to that was known as Laravel Park, but early in the 20th century, this was where the protests would end. And this is actually the site where the Vancouver Art Gallery is planning to move. It's just another shot down Hastings Street. And one of the things about, of course, when you have a few thousand people over that duration of time occupying public space, thank you, the government of the day, both provincially and civically, were pointing the finger at each other. And so it was creating a huge amount of tension during that period. We just passed Mother's Day here, but this is a photograph of the mothers of the relief camp workers. Most of the people who were sent to the camps were males under the age of 30, which fits the time. But the social movement was quite broad, had broad public support around Vancouver. And of course, this was only about 18 years after the Russian Revolution, and these types of social movements, mass economic displacement, also meant that there was movements like the Communist Party of Canada were mainstream. They had several thousand members, and this was not considered a radical activity, but there was a real fear from the central government of a possible insurrection. This photograph, Mark Lear, I think, shows in his labor history class, but the tensions that sometimes happen between movements, within movements. We saw that during the Olympics. We've seen that in various periods of social movement formation here in Vancouver, but the idea of dreaming big and being tactical and specific can coexist side to side, and sometimes they don't. But you see that in many of the things that people were pushing for at the time, fighting for unemployment insurance, pensions, public health care. Many of these things didn't happen until after the Second World War, into the 50s and the 60s. This is an iconic photograph from the era from April of 1935 when a number of protesters entered into the art gallery and museum that was inside the Carnegie Center, occupied it for 3 days relief, which basically meant that people, a day's relief, you would get 3 coupons and tickets to take to one of the restaurants in the neighborhood to be able to eat, as the equivalent of food stamps would be in the US, but then in a context where social programs didn't exist. So this is actually supporters who rallied outside the Carnegie Center. The food was prepared at the Ukrainian Hall that's in Strathcona, and was lifted up into the 3rd floor window. Of course, what eventually ensued is the civic and the provincial governments pointed their fingers towards each other on who was to blame. Because it was a federal program, at the back of one of these meetings, somebody yelled, "On to Ottawa." And so they decided literally to get on the back of these boxcars in June of 1935. I don't have one of the photographs here, but in the era before, Facebook and Twitter to organize political meetings, people literally wore sandwich boards of 10 or 20 people and would march up and down Hastings all day in preparation for a meeting for the evening in order to promote it. So about 1,000 people jumped on these trains, and as they went to Golden, to Calgary, more people would join them, and they would stop and have rallies in those cities and jump on the next train over. This is a shot from Strathcona. This is as people were actually gone, heading towards Ottawa. There was a huge, a famous battle between the dock workers and the police. There was an anti-union legislation that was being brought in along the ports all along the west coast, and there was about a 4-hour fight in Strathcona. And in 2010, the longshoremen put up an art project in Britannia Beach to commemorate that. Eventually, the people on the train made it to Regina, and they were stopped by the police, and a delegation was allowed to go to Ottawa to explain their grievances. And in the meantime, as they were in Ottawa, more RCMP were sent to Regina. And so this is Canada Day 1935. Most of the people here are from Vancouver. In the foreground is a tar-making machine, which is for road building, and people are literally ripping pieces off of the machine and utilizing them as projectiles. I'll show a few photos from that fight. And some of the tensions that emerge in these kind of moments of economic collapse. Of course, in Chinatown, we had the 1907, the anti-Asiatic riots, followed by the head tax, followed by discriminatory legislation that didn't allow for family reunification. This is a shot from 1935, and this is a group from Chinatown who were protesting the Anglican Church, who in their charitable efforts in their soup lines wouldn't extend those to people who were non-Caucasian. And so this is part of the organizing that was happening at the time. Most of the protests at the time would start at, before it was called the Powell Street Grounds, and then Oppenheimer Park. This is shot a little bit later in 1938 in Oppenheimer Park, and so that's about 3,000 people there at the time. Much of this movement was undermined eventually as Canada entered the Second World War. Partially the war economy lifted Canada out of the Depression, but also the kind of movement to kind of not disrupt the broader society was also a part of the collapse of the movement. This is a sit-in at the post office in 1938 as well. Just going to show one more photograph, and this is undercover police officers. I'm just going to come back to a couple of points around the kind of necessary tensions between civil society, social movements, and politics in general. And I think as these fields attempt to produce their truths, cartographies are vitally important to tell their story. And in the way that Badiou, when he talks about philosophy, he lists certain fields that are part of the procedures of the truths that philosophy is trying to create. And he lists them as the political field, love, art, and science. And when philosophy sutures itself into any of these fields, it becomes a disaster. And that really there needs to be a movement of idea between these fields and help produce the truths of philosophy. And in being able to work here in East Vancouver, which is a complicated term unto itself, especially given the rapid gentrification that's happening not just in the downtown east side, but in Mount Pleasant, in Commercial Drive, the kind of subjectivities that are possible, and the notion of embodied politics, the notions of the body, are, I think, incredibly important in formalizing those political subjectivities. One of the things I've been fortunate enough to do over the years is doing different walks, historical walks through different neighborhoods, whether they be Mount Pleasant or Strathcona or the downtown east side. And as problematic as it might be walking through neighborhoods, I think actually for people to walk through and to actually physically be a part of those spaces, to think through historical moments and to actually project them today. I don't know quite how to explain it in an articulate way, but there's something visceral about that experience that's necessary part of a kind of learning process and an opportunity to kind of engage in a kind of discussion with physical space. I think I'm going to leave it at that so we have time for conversation. So, thanks.